What do we know about the people who will move? What do they think we need for a good life? Will they come from nearby and speak another language? Will they come from far away and speak our language? When will we become the ones who move? What will we bring with us? How will we greet one another? In the past, what has architecture offered those who move? What could architecture offer them in the future?
So this is the story of a housing complex that is highly emblematic of a certain period of migration in Greece, a period which in many ways has marked the history of new Greek state and the history of architecture in Greece. We're talking about a complex which is widely known as Alexandra's Prosfυγικά. It's a complex of buildings built in 1933 to 1935. And I will try to follow the indications that show that this complex is indeed a very important turning point for architectural as well as political and social history in Athens. Let us first imagine the conditions under which these buildings were actually built. We're talking about Athens in mid-war period in 1930s, a rather small European city of 200,000 people, in which suddenly, due to conditions that had to do with a confrontation between Turkey and Greece, had to receive an additional population totally comparable to the population already in the city. So we're talking about almost doubling the population of the city because of a population exchange with Turkey. So the newcomers were, in most cases, people who used to live in the seaside cities of Asia Minor. They were people with cosmopolitan habits, in many cases educated, and we could also say that they were even more related to Europe than actually the Athenians of that period. So let us imagine those people suddenly coming to Greece with almost nothing, deprived of all their belongings, and at the mercy of conditions that would have to support them, would have to provide them decent forms of living and perhaps a job. So I'm using this expression to, in a way, show how dramatic the conditions were. Let us not forget that we're talking about a period in which we have a global crisis. 1929 is very near. We're talking about a period in which the Greek state was almost bankrupt, also because of the preceding 1922 war, and not in the position to help those people, or perhaps not very much willing to help them unless they would accept a role in the new society as cheap labor force, for example. So in various ways, the Greek state managed to ensure building, housing buildings for many of those people. At the first period, of course, we're talking about shanty towns around major cities of Greece, like Athens, Piraeus, and Thessaloniki. But then, as we approach the 30s, the Greek state is already in the position, of course, with the help of the League of Nations of that period, what we know now as the United Nations, but at that period was called the League of Nations. So with the help of the League of Nations and loans coming from abroad, the Greek state was in the position of developing some projects for housing for those people. The interesting thing is that this urgent need for housing coincided with a very crucial and a very productive and creative period of architectural design, production, and thinking. The period that we know as the beginning of modernism, the period which is very much connected to the international congresses of modernist architecture, the SIAM, as we know them. In that period, and especially in 1933, we had very important meetings of modern architects declaring new values, declaring new ways of approaching the problem of city and the problem of housing. In 1929, we already had one of those congresses dedicated to the issue of existence minimum, the minimum existence. What should be the standards for the building of new cities and new neighborhoods, provided that we are not aiming at consumption, but rather on helping people satisfy their basic needs. In 1933, we have the Charter of Athens, a charter of modernist architecture that was developed mainly by Le Corbusier and Gropius and Siegfried Gideon, people who were actually aiming at not simply producing ideas about a better architecture, but also producing ideas about a form of architecture which is engaged in its social role, architecture aiming at satisfying the needs of the many and not the dreams or the fantasies of the few. So in these conditions, in this context of urgency, but also fertile discussion about the role of architecture, we have two architects building the Prosphygika of Alexandra's buildings, developing a project that became emblematic of this kind of period for Greek architecture, but also for modernist architecture in general. The one is Kyriakos. He was actually a civil engineer who designed the first 4 buildings of the complex. We're talking about 8 buildings in a complex. And then we have Laskaris, who is a well-known architect of that period, educated in France and in Germany, who is responsible for the design of the 4 buildings that would be integrated in the final form of the complex. So we're talking about 8 buildings, 228 apartments. And interestingly, those 2 people who designed the buildings were actually very much conscious of the novelty and of the social meaning related to modernist architecture. Laskaris, the person I already mentioned as an educated architect in Europe, and was very much familiar with the ideas of Gropius and Bauhaus experimentations on social housing. So he was indeed well aware of the need to design rational, modernist, efficient housing buildings. So this is exactly what characterizes Prosphygika of Alexandra's design. We can indeed see that in one of the first publications referring to the newly built complexes. It comes out of the Chamber of Commerce journal of that period in 1936. And the newly built buildings were actually presented as characterized by the same tradition of minimum housing standards coming from Bauhaus experimentations. You can actually see that in the form and in the layout. It's the lesson of Bauhaus which is prevalent. And also we have a picture which comes from the archive of Poulidis, a well-known photographer of that period, that shows those buildings in their newly built conditions. What we can indeed see in those pictures is that those buildings are completely separated from their urban environment. With, in some cases, as I managed to learn from discussions with inhabitants of that period, in some cases they were even seen as foreign objects having landed on Athens. They were so different from the surrounding neighborhoods. They were so different from the popular neoclassical buildings surrounding the area, or the more prestigious, let's say, neoclassical buildings related to public buildings or to public urban planning gestures. So let us see those buildings as characteristic aims of developing a different urban and architectural paradigm, if I may say so. A kind of suggestion that the city can develop in a different way. A kind of model to be reproduced in various other areas, showing that urban neighborhoods can have different form, can have different conditions. Surely those conditions are better in terms of ventilation, sunshine, and generally sanitary infrastructure. But on the other hand, this rational layout had nothing to do with this maze of small streets and this kind of familiar image of the developing city, a city developing out of a historical background with lots of particularities, lots of interesting and unexpected specificities. No, we're talking about the city from scratch. We're talking about a gesture that wants to produce the city from scratch. And as we know, this is one of the main aspirations and dreams of modernist architecture, especially Le Corbusier's vision about the city of the future. We have to understand also that at that period, we had interesting changes in the existing legal and institutional conditions concerning housing. First of all, of course, some of the urgent legislature developed at that period had to do with the accommodation of the newcomers, compulsory expropriation was in many cases used in order to ensure the existence of available land for those projects. Also, a novel part of legislation had to do with the idea of horizontal property conditions, which made it possible for the owning of apartments from different owners, and not simply total ownership referring to the owner of the plot. It's a major innovation in urban lawmaking for that period, which had, if I might say so, a double-edged result. On the one hand, it helped speed up real estate conditions, speed up profit making through the development of housing in unbuilt areas through speculation, land speculation. On the other hand, it helped make it possible for individual ownership also in this kind of buildings. So the refugees, the migrants coming from Asia Minor, were potentially the owners of their own houses. This is an interesting particularity. This is an interesting effect of the policies of that period, and very, very much studied by theoreticians and historians of Greek architecture and urban planning, because it shows that the state was actually willing to integrate those people to the society that they had to come as petit bourgeois owners of small apartments. So the state gave them the opportunity to pay with very low interest loans, to pay back for those small apartments, the state which owned them, in order to be able to become owners themselves. This is a kind of keeping those people, first of all, attached to the area and not available to negotiate their labor power through the mobility that in certain cases gives people the opportunity to find better jobs, but then they have to find a place to stay also. This is totally obstructed if the major policy is to make workers buy their house and stay in the place where they own the house. And this, of course, has shaped also the specificity of house owning history in Greece. We have almost the largest house owning ratio in Europe, which is an indication of what kind of society was built after that period in the 30s and the 40s. One other interesting aspect of this complex is the fact that it remained, although those conditions were actually conditions of emergency, it remained for many years a neighborhood with a collective life, with interesting collective habits, with a sharing of culture between those people who came from mostly the same places. And it became almost a hub of cultural production, a hub of interesting hybrid intersections between cultural habits and artistic and cultural performances, because those refugees, those migrants coming from Asia Minor were actually carrying a very interesting urban cosmopolitan culture, as I tried to say before. On the other hand, this made them quite different from the Athenians of that period. So they also tell stories about conditions of stigmatization, conditions that made them feel that they were foreigners, although they spoke the same language, they shared the same culture, the same religion with the locals. And this made it an interesting urban phenomenon, if I might say, because the conditions which made this neighborhood almost enclosed to itself through stigmatization also made this neighborhood a condenser of a cultural influence that was meant to leave its own mark in the recent history of Athens and Greece in general. So interestingly, this is not simply the story of migration as conditions that create ghettos of those who are forced to come to a different country. This is at the same time is a story of migration that managed to insert itself in the society which would in a way accept or host them, and even become major protagonists in certain cases of events that would change the history of that period. that change the history of the society, or even activate elements of this society that would produce new formations, new forms in terms of culture, but also in class relations.